Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode 63. When did it happen? And today we're going to look at the Phyrexia, all will be one. And I'm going to look at it from a slightly different perspective. I'm going to look at the mechanics, but not to describe what they do, but rather to try to position different mechanics and try to speculate on strategies that you can apply to play those mechanics and how you can play them and what will be successful and not. Obviously, since the set has not been yet released, it's going to be quite speculative, but it's going to be maybe a slight window of how I think about formats, how I formulate plans before I start drafting, because I very often, before I even open a first pack, I have an idea what I want to do, and I have a couple of plans that I will start implementing as soon as I see particular cards that trigger a certain response in me. But before we go into that, this stream is sponsored by MTGA Zone. If you have some time, you want to read some limited content, maybe you're interested in Constructed, MTGA Zone is a pretty good place to go. It has really great writers. J2S Josh is writing their limited articles. I think that finally, after a long hiatus, I'm going to write this thing up and publish it there. Because I think that this is something that can be pretty general and on how to make plans. I like to make my articles more like level ups kind of style rather than write the current things. But of course, it will be based in the reality of the current set. And before I go into the actual topic, I always like to start with the preamble. And we are after yet another preview season, and I think that this is a thought I've been, combating for quite some time. It's worth thinking about what you can predict in the new set and where it is better to wait and see. Because, of course, especially when you create content, you're sort of paid to have hot takes, and sometimes those hot takes pay off because you're right. Sometimes those hot takes, well, everyone forgets the wrong ones. Unless they are spectacularly wrong, then they will remind you. They will remind you that for the rest of your life. But I think that what is worth to think as a content creator and also as a person that just wants to understand the format before it's released is that there are some things that are easier to conceptualize dry just in your thought rather than by playing, and some that are more difficult. And I think it's really difficult to figure out which colors are going to be good. And I don't want to spend too much time on thinking, oh, white is going to be busted, oh, red is looking like it's going to be poor, because those things are very often verified. And I would probably guess that if you would ask content creators which colors are the best in a particular set, and you will have like a sample of 50 of them, and then you will basically look at the answers, ranks, score them, and then come up with some maths. They would be not much better than if you would do it by random. We are very often blindsided by some mechanics. We are very often too excited about some mechanics because they just appeal to what people want to do, and that doesn't work very well. So instead of doing that, before I start playing in the set, I like to look at the context of every color without actually grading them in any power level. Some of them I will have no idea how to build them, and if I look at the set and I analyze it and I read a lot of the cards and I try to match them and see where the synergies lie, and I still don't see any kind of like solution that's pretty obvious to me, um, these colors will probably have to wait and be reevaluated. I still have some, very initial idea of what I want to do, but I'd rather check which cards are actually validated by data. And like data from after 1 week is usually pretty good in predicting what's going to be happening in the format later. Actually, card power is probably very well predicted by the first week data. It's just that what is open and what is not will change slightly over time. And sometimes, first week decks are not strong because they contain cards that no one predicted that are going to be strong. But very often, first week decks are really strong because particular card combinations are really open and you can get really powerful cards on the wheel. Later, when you stop having those cards on the wheel or late in the pack, you lose that advantage, and those decks become a bit weaker because you just don't have access to that many cards. That's why I measure the openness of each color pair in the first weeks of data, because that way you can sort of see how many cards of each color combinations that are powerful you're going to see throughout the draft on average, and that changes quite a lot. But the power of the cards themselves is pretty well validated by the first week win rates. Um, right, and again, maybe you will see some obvious bombs, and they will be probably very good. Still, they might be a bit weaker because of the color context. So even if the card is super strong, think about, is it supported in a way that will you be able to play it in a deck that has ways of winning that is not that bomb? Because obviously that's just one card. You'll draw it roughly 50% of the time when you play. Um, so don't put too much weight on black having like three busted bombs if there is no other support for those cards, and we will learn that in the first week. So instead of looking at those kind of color specifics and trying to rank things, what I decided to do is I decided to look at the mechanics of the set and try to think about different plans that you can have for those mechanics, and using fundamentals, using prior knowledge, using similar things from the past, I try to figure out how can you maximize those mechanics, and where, in which colors would you find the best homes for them, and that will inform my first week of drafting. As soon as we start getting data, I will also update my preconceptions with the actual solid facts. Right, so all be one mechanics, I decided to highlight 5 of them. There's toxic. Toxic being a creature has toxic of X, and it means that apart from dealing it damage, when it connects with the player, it also gives them X poison counters. Um, Toxic poison counters, obviously, when you have 10 of them, you die, and there is no way of removing them, so it's a sort of like a life gain resistant way of killing that actually is faster than damage in terms of how much you have to inflict. Second ability is corrupted. Corrupted, it gives a card additional ability or enhances the ability it has when opponent has 3 or more poison counters. Third ability is proliferate, and that means that you can put a counter on any permanent that already has a counter of the same type, obviously. Um, and these 3 mechanics are sort of connected because you attack with a toxic creature, it gives a couple of poison counters. Then you proliferate, you add another toxic counter on that player. Then your corrupted is online, and you can cast spells for slightly higher value. So they are sort of like linked in a sort of package, and there's going to be a lot of overlap between all those mechanics. Then proliferate has many flavors. The other mechanic that we have in the set is oil, and oil are counters on creatures, and every single time they do something different. So I listed 6 themes of oil in terms of how it works, but there's also multiple themes of oil on how you put the counters on the permanent, but they do just different things. It's just like a creature has put an oil counter when this happens, or when it enters the battlefield, put oil, or put oil on something, and that oil will have different abilities. You can remove some oil counters, and something happens. You can add oil counters, and the creature becomes better, and things like that. Again, because oil are counters, proliferate is linked to that because you can proliferate all your oil counters if you want to. So that's another kind of synergy connection. And there's the 5th mechanic for Mirrodin, which is not linked to the other 4, specifically in red and white colors most of the time. And that's just an ability of equipment that when it enters the battlefield, you create a 2/2 creature that becomes attached to the equipment. So sort of equipment has something that can wear it and wears it automatically. And then when the thing dies, you can reuse the equipment to equip other creatures. So these are the 5 mechanics. And we can go to the first one, toxic. And toxic creatures have sort of dual nature because they do have power and toughness. Power is being more important in that context, but they also can deal poison damage to the player. So both of the aspects are important because power is not only important when it connects, but power is also important when it doesn't. When a creature becomes blocked, it will only deal the damage according to its power. And poison is obviously twice as fast as damage. So because of that, decks that will have toxic creatures might have different plans, depending on how likely are you going to be to deal this, 10 poison damage over the game. And depending on how likely you're going to be to deal the 10 poison damage, you will have to build your deck slightly differently. So to look at the toxic from the data perspective, I looked at what are the stats of the creatures that have toxic in the format. And I divided them into three categories. One is the toxic, more toxic than damage creatures. And that means this is a 1/1 creature with toxic 1. If it connects, it deals 5% of starting life damage in regular damage. But if it connects, it also deals 1 poison damage, which is 10% of the maximum poison that you have before you die. So this creature is more toxic than damage. This creature kills you twice as fast using the poison counters than it does using the regular damage. So these creatures I call more toxic than damage. Then there are creatures that have exactly the same. So this is a 2/2 that has toxic 1. If it connects, it deals 2 damage to the player and it deals 1 poison counter. So 10% of starting life in damage and 10% of maximum poison in poison damage. So they are equally as toxic as damage. And the third category are creatures that have more regular damage than poison. So here I have an example of Indoctrination Attendant. That's a 4-mana 3/4, and it has toxic 1. So if this creature connects, it deals 3 damage, so 15% of starting life in damage, and it deals 1 poison counter, which is 10% of the max poison counter. So it's slightly more on the damage side than toxic. Therefore, category is more damage than toxic. And I did calculation for those for all the creatures in the format. And I found that actually roughly 50% of all the creatures are more toxic than damage. All creatures with toxic, obviously. So majority of commons and uncommons will have more toxic than damage. Quite a large chunk of rare and mythic creatures also have more toxic than damage. Then around 40%, slightly less than 40% of the creatures are going to be equal. So they deal the same amount of damage and toxic if you divide them by the, how much damage you need to deal with either of them. And only 12% or so of creatures have more damage than toxic. And also, when you think about it, those creatures will very often have other abilities that make it slightly advantageous to deal poison damage, because I think one of them has trample, and obviously you can block out normal damage by trample, but if something tramples, it still deals damage to the opponent, which means that they still get a poison counter. 2 of those creatures, and one of them was the Indoctrination Attendant, they can generate another 1/1 toxic creature, which means that if you play the card to the fullest, it generates 1 extra power and 1 extra toxic. That means that actually, when you calculate this in, they are moved to the category of being equally as toxic as damage, because a 3/4 with toxic 1 and a 1/1 with toxic 1, they deal 4 damage to the face and 2 poison counters, which is equivalent. So even those that deal more damage than poison counters, even those, they have special circumstances that will cause them to be more toxic than damage. And this means that if you build decks that purely contain creatures with toxic, you will be more likely to end up killing your opponent with the toxic damage than killing them with regular damage. And that's an important thing to know when you're trying to build decks that kill with poison counters. You really need to max out on the toxic creatures. And also, you have to keep in mind that even if you don't deal all the damage with the poison counters, you can proliferate it. So you can go to a certain point when you deal 8 poison damage, and then the last 2 you might do without attacking. So let's look at the more damage creatures, and there's 4 of them. Stinging Hive Master, that's a 3 mana 3/2 with Toxic 1. But when it dies, it creates a 1/1 with a Toxic 1. So in total, all the pieces of cardboard that this card is likely to generate have 4 power and 2 toxic, which means that it's actually an equal creature. Indoctrination Attendant, I already said. Again, 4 power and 2 toxic in total if you use the full ability. There is the Caromonix, the Rat King. That's a 3 mana 3/3 with toxic 1. So this one clearly on its own, it has more damage than toxic, but it gives toxic 1 to all other rats that you control. And I assume that if you play it in your deck, you probably have some rats, which means that it can actually tilt this, because if it gives toxic 1 to another creature, that becomes toxic 2, and it only has 3 power, so it tilts the damage, it tilts the balance towards being more toxic than damage, actually, in this case. And the last one is Bloated Contaminator, the 3 mana 4/4 trample with toxic 1. Here, the case is it has trample, so you can block out the majority of the damage from the creature, and it will deal toxic. And also, what it has is when it deals combat damage, you proliferate, which means that it deals damage, you put 1 poison counter, and you proliferate it, the second one. So even if not blocked, it will generate 2 toxic counters actually while dealing 4 damage, which makes it into the even category again. So excluding those 4, which theoretically deal more damage than toxic, actually every single creature with toxic will deal more poison counter damage, or at least equal amount of poison counter damage as it will do regular damage proportionally. So toxic, in terms of plan, it focuses around absent colors. And I think that if you play in absent colors, you should either focus on winning with poison or avoiding toxic. Because since all the toxic creatures deal more damage in poison counters, doing so until a certain step and then switching a strategy to trying to deal phase damage is going to be detrimental for you, because you already did so much work in dealing this toxic damage that you might as well continue with it and have the uniform plan. And I think that actually, when you look at it, pretty good strategy for that will be to maybe try to build your toxic decks that want to focus on dealing this 10 poison damage as a 3-color deck with all absent things, because then you can combine the very powerful early game from white and black that can deal early toxic damage with a very powerful late game from green that can deal late poison damage. And that's a very interesting combination. Plus, you get access to a multiple of the really strong toxic signposts and commons. So that's going to be pretty useful for you, because both white, green, black, green, and white, black do help you when you are doing toxic. Now, the problem with toxic, again, is that combat tricks giving power and toughness boosts are not going to forward your plan to win with poison counters, which means that there is a good case, if you are trying to win with poison counters, to use those combat tricks rather than to push damage. You use it to defend your creatures and make sure that they survive combat. Also, your toxic creatures are usually going to be slightly smaller, so you can use your combat tricks as a sort of semi-removal spell, because your 2/2 might now kill the 3/3, and then you have still, hopefully, after playing the combat trick, you still have mana to play something else, and you extend your board while removing something from the board of the opponent, and you win on the board presence. Because toxic, because it has smaller creatures, you want to have a large board presence. And this is, again, one reason why I think it's nice combining the absent colors, because the white gives you more access to the mites, which are 1/1s that have toxic. You can generate multiples of them, and then you can just swing with several attacks that maybe go in for 2-3 damage, but they also go in for 2-3 toxic, which means you put 3 poison counters, and that's much more valuable than going in for 3 damage at the cost of sacrificing some board presence. And this is all fine and nice, unless, of course, your goal is to turn on corrupted. Corrupted is the ability where when the opponent has three or more poison counters, you get something extra from your cards. And this is a reason for not wanting to really kill your opponent with poison counters, but just to get the corrupted online and then using the extra value that you get from corrupted to make sure that you win the game because your cards are now much more powerful. And there's 17 spells with corrupted. They are all focused on the Esper part of the color pipe. So black, white, blue. And I sort of classified them into three types of corrupted. And the first one is the one you want to get it as early as possible. Um, the second one is the ones that are aging with the game, which means that you should be still okay when you don't put it online by turn 5, but maybe by turn 6, 7, you really want it to happen because it opens new possibilities. And the other is optional. When I think that corrupted, it's nice to have it, but the card is actually either good or bad enough without corrupted that you don't care that much if you have the opponent at 3 poison counters or not. So corrupted ASAPs, the ones that you want to get early, I put Bone Picker Scourge. That's a 3 mana 2/2 flyer, and then when you have corrupted, it gets Death Touch and Lifelink. You want to have it early because if you don't, that becomes a 3 mana Wind Drake, which is not at rate. I think the 3 mana Death Touch Lifelink can be pretty good. Uh, Incisor Glider, that's a 2 mana flyer with that's 1/3. And with corrupted, whenever it attacks, if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, all the creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This ability, I mean, I think last sets showed us how powerful it can be in terms of winning the games with a couple of creatures that needed 4 or 5 mana to activate that ability. This one can have it for free, which is super powerful, especially when you have multiples of Incisor Glider. But of course, you want it as early as possible because you want to get that kind of momentum and boost your party. And last one is Zealot's Conviction, my secret bet on one of the most powerful commons in the set. It's a 1 mana flash enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1. But if you have corrupted, as long as opponent has 3 or more poison counters, enchanted creature gets an additional +1/+0 and has first strike. So it's a 1 mana flash +2/+1 first strike, which will be something that will win you combats. Maybe you block something, you play this, you kill their creature, then you have actually a formidable attacker that is +2/+1 first strike that they still need to deal with. So the corrupted ASAPs will probably require a slightly different game plan. Like Bone Picker Scourge, if you get corrupted, does not bring you closer to winning the game with poison counters. Incisor Glider does not get you closer to winning with poison counters. Zealous Conviction does not get you closer to winning with poison counters. So some of those decks that base on lots of corrupted synergies, they will need to be capable of being really quick to produce the corrupted condition. And then from the moment when you have those 3 poison counters, you just forget about your plan about corrupted, about killing with poison counters and focus on the plan of actually killing them with regular damage. So I think that if you want to play those ASAPs, you want to have either very early creatures with toxic, like 1/1s for 1, things like that. Maybe like a 1/1 with flying for 2 mana, that would be perfect for that. And then you want to have majority of your creatures to be even on the damage to corrupted, because those creatures deal as much damage in toxic and in regular damage. Therefore, because you have those bonuses like Zealot's Conviction, like Incisor Glider, they will very quickly overtake the rate at which you're dealing the poison damage and will start being the threat to their actual life total. Then you have the corrupted Wait and Chill. And the cards I show here, Anoint with Affliction. It's a 2 mana removal, exile target creature if it has mana value 3 or less. And with Corrupted, it actually exiles any creature. So in the early game, you don't really care that much because in the first 3 turns, they will not play anything that is more than 3 mana most of the time. So it plays perfectly like a removal early in the game without having Corrupted. But maybe later in the game you want to deal with larger threats. You want to have that corrupted online at some stage. Bring the ending, same thing. Counter target spells unless its controller pays 2, and if you have corrupted, counter any spell. So in the first few turns, usually opponent taps out, so this will counter anything. Later in the game, you probably want to have corrupted so that this card is not dead when they start casting 6 drops and still have 4 mana left. And slightly different card here in Chittering Skitterling. That's a 3 mana 1/4, and we have corrupted. It gains an ability: sacrifice an artifact or creature, draw a card, activate only. Corrupted basically. Um, and also you can only activate it once each turn, but you also can activate it on the opponent's turn, which is a great value engine when you have small things that you can sacrifice. You can sacrifice things in response to removal if they, by some reason, choose to remove something else than this. Obviously, it can sacrifice to itself. So if you have corrupted, it will be quite useful. But usually in the early game, you want to trade your live board presence, so you will not be having too many sacrifice fodder, which means that early maybe it is a like 3 mana 1/4 that can block some things, but you still want to get it online because you want to get the value from it at some stage. So in this strategy, if you want to wait and chill, you want to maybe get like 1, maybe 2 like poison counters on the opponent, and at some stage you will maybe cast a spell with proliferate or whatnot, and that will bring the corrupted online. And then you can have multiple strategies. You can play a long game with toxic when you control the board and maybe have random proliferate effects or maybe repeatable sources of proliferate that will allow you to control the board and at the same time continue into killing the opponent, or you can play bigger things and kill them with damage because you don't care that much about killing them with toxic. Either way, it really depends how your deck is built and how it's designed. I think that the important thing is that you need to have ways of getting at least that first 1 or 2 toxic damage on board, and after that, if your deck is not built to go the full length and dealing 10 poison damage, you might actually change to some kind of more conventional strategy. And there are some cards that I counted as optional. There's Phyrexian Atlas with Corrupted. It's a mana rock for 3 mana with Corrupted. Whenever it becomes tapped, opponent loses a life, which clearly wants you to kill them, not with toxic counters, so you don't care about anything over 3. But I think that you will play this card because you are in the market for a mana rock or maybe some artifact synergies, and not because you want to have that corrupted ability and ping them for 1 every turn. I think that's just gravy. Ravenous Necrotitan, that's a 4 mana 6/6. When you don't have corrupted, you have to sacrifice a creature when you play it, and when you have corrupted, you don't. Just a vanilla 6/6 for 4 mana. I think that this card is perfectly playable without any corrupted. You just need to make sure that your deck can accommodate sacrificing some piece of cardboard when this enters the battlefield. And lastly, we have Feed the Infection. That's a 4 mana, draw 3, lose 3 life. When you have corrupted, also each opponent loses 3 life. Again, that points towards trying to kill your opponent with actual normal damage. But I think that if you are in for playing this card, you don't care about the corrupted clause. You just want to draw 3 cards. That's your main goal. And corrupted is sort of like, again, gravy. Sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't, but it shouldn't change the evaluation of your card. Maybe like a small tiebreaker. Right, so that's the strategies for the corrupted. Now we have proliferate, and there are 33 cards with proliferate or with proliferate synergies. I clustered them all together just to see what chunk of the cards are playing well with proliferate or having proliferate. And this is focused in the Sultai. So corrupted was an Esper. This is in Sultai, so blue, black, and green. And obviously proliferate means you can put a counter of any type on any permanent that is on board or any player. So you can proliferate poison, you can proliferate other counters. And I divided those things as sort of 4 different types of proliferate strategies. First one will be proliferate as a plan in its own. When You don't even probably care if you proliferate anything, but just proliferating gives you some kind of value. Second one is a proliferate as poison source. And this is for decks that will deal some poison damage and later proliferate on towards the 10. That's probably your plan. Um, Third, it's a group of cards where proliferate is an option, where you can be quite flexible in what you want to do. You can either use them proliferating if it's beneficial for you, if you drew a certain half of your deck, for example, that will benefit from proliferating. But sometimes those cards have other options which don't require proliferating. So you're sort of split between what you want to do and flexible in that way. And the fourth one is proliferate as oil synergy, because lots of cards will have oil counters, and obviously it's nice and well to proliferate at poison counters, but it's just basically like tagging along deal 2 damage to an opponent to every spell that you cast with proliferate. Sometimes you want to get more, and there's plenty of oil cards in the colors that also have proliferate, and therefore you can try to basically benefit from increasing the count of your oil counters on cards. We're going to have a lot about oil in a second, so we're going to go maybe deeper into those strategies. But now I'm just going to signal that you can proliferate as an origin synergy. So for proliferate as a plan, there's like 4 cards really in the whole set that are really decent payoffs for you proliferating without having any counters on. First is Scheming Aspirant. That's a 2-mana 1/3. Whenever you proliferate, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life, so drain 2. You can think this as a sort of alternative win con, especially when you have maybe a couple of them. Every proliferate spells you play from now on will drain them for 2, drain them for 4, and that accumulates pretty quickly. And especially if the opponent is not trying to kill you with toxins, the life gain is relevant. And if they do try to kill you with toxins, the actual 1/3 body might be quite menacing for some of those toxic creatures that are not so big, especially when they're outside of green. Second, that's an uncommon payoff, which is important because this is the one that you're going to see the most. Second payoff is Venser, Corpse Puppet. That's again a 2-mana 1/3, this time 1 blue and 1 black, unlike the Scheming Aspirant, it's just 1 and a black. It has lifelink, it has Toxic 1, and whenever you proliferate, you can choose one. If you don't control a creature named the Hollow Sentinel, create the Hollow Sentinel, a legendary 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem. And if you have the Golem on board already, then if you proliferate, target artifact creature you control, which means that the Golem can be that, gains flying and lifelink until end of turn. So that's a really solid proliferate payoff, especially the first one when you create a 3/3. So you got a 2-mana thing, and incidentally, you also create a 3/3 body to accompany it. But also, like giving those Golem flying and lifelink until end of turn will let you race quite efficiently. And also, like if they kill the Golem, you can just proliferate again and get another copy because you don't control the Golem, so you can create a new one. I think it's a neat payoff for proliferating just without even doing anything, without even like adding any extra counters. However, worth noting that Venser can, if you're on the play, can probably go in for 1 if you play it well. And from then on, every proliferate is also going to bring you closer to that corrupted threshold. Every and of course, Venser being in blue-black is in those Esper colors. When I said that, I said are quite interested in having corrupted online at some stage. And you can again conceive of plans that include killing the opponent with damage or killing them with proliferating poison counters if your deck is more inclined towards dealing poison damage. Third one is Azuri, Stalker of Spheres. That's a rare. Venser was also a rare. Azuri, Stalker of Spirits is a 4-mana, 2 green and blue, so in Simic colors. When it enters the battlefield, you may pay 3. If you do, you proliferate twice. And it also has a pass static ability. Whenever you proliferate, draw a card. So you can play it as a 4-mana 3/3. You can play it for 7 mana as a 3/3 that draws 2 cards, which I think is a decent ability if you are later in the game and you have the 7 mana. But also every single other proliferate spell or effect that causes you to proliferate will draw your card. So I can imagine it playing it on 4 attacking with something that proliferates on attack and drawing a card, and boom, you paid off your 3/3. You basically constructed your own 3/3 drawer card, which is still a decent card. And the more you proliferate, the more cards you draw, and you can basically outvalue the opponent if that stays alive for some time. Voidwing Hybrid, that's the last proliferate as a plan card that I want to highlight. It's a 2-mana 2/1 flyer for blue and black. It has Toxic 1, and whenever you proliferate, you return the hybrid from your graveyard to your hand. So it's a recursive, evasive threat that deals Toxic and benefits from you proliferating. So even though this card is even in terms of how much damage does it do in regular damage and in Toxic damage, um, because if it dies, you need to proliferate to get it back, you will sort of be slightly ahead on the Toxic counters, which make me think, well, this one is a pretty good enabler of the strategy of killing with combination of Toxic and proliferate to make sure that the opponent has 10 poison counters. So these are the only 4 cards, which means that you probably want to be on this plan when you open one of those cards or draft them earlier. You know, like you get pack 1, pick 4 Venser, or pack 1, pick 5 Azuri. You see, well, maybe not only green-blue is open, but also the proliferate payoff is there. Maybe I can pick up like a late scheming aspirant. Maybe I'll get a Voidwing Hybrid later in the game. You have a couple of those payoffs, and then you can start thinking, okay, I'm going to go slightly all in on the proliferate and try to make a deck that doesn't really care about much, but wants to proliferate just for the proliferation's sake. But of course, in those decks, if you pick some oil synergies, it's fine. If you pick some cards that give poison counters to the opponent, it's also fine. You can combine those strategies and carve your sort of way into it. And of course, it's nice to have those payoffs, but you need to have good enablers. And it's nice to cast a spell that has proliferate tagged onto it, but it's not going to push you very far. So what you want is you want to have reproducible proliferate triggers. And there's 3 of those cards that I highlight. First is Thrumming Bird. That's a 2-mana, 1 and a blue, 1/1 flyer. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you proliferate. So this is the creature I told you that you can do when you play some kind of a proliferate payoff. While this is on board, attack, proliferate, boom, you have your effect very quickly. And it will do it next turn unless the opponent kills it. So pretty useful thing for those proliferate decks. And obviously also pretty useful for quite the large number of oil payoffs. And that can be in blue and adjacent colors. Second card, Bloated Contaminator. That's we already mentioned it when we were discussing the creatures that have more power than Toxic damage. A 3-mana 4/4 trample for 2 and a green with Toxic 1. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, proliferates. So same ability as the Thrumming Bird, but on a much more attractive 4/4 trampling body. So even if it's blocked, it might push some damage through, give Toxic, amplify the Toxic, amplify all the oil synergies, etc., etc., etc. Also, because it has trample, combat tricks are quite prime for that card. Because opponent can double block it, combat trick blows them out of the water, and still they get the Toxic, and still you get the proliferate. So quite a cool card. Obviously, it's a rare, so don't hold your breath on getting it. But worth knowing that it's there. And the last one is Tainted Observer. That's the Simic Signpost uncommon, 1 green-blue for a 2/3 flyer with Toxic 1. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 2 mana if you do proliferate. So, you play this, you play some payoff, and then every creature that you play, if you have enough mana, is going to be another proliferation and another set of effects that you do. So this is the proliferate as a plan. You need to have those enablers. You need to have those payoffs. It's not going to be a deck that comes together very often, but when it does, that's going to be the one that you're going to share on your Twitter and post it in different Discords because it will be sweet. But I think that the reality of things is that the more common version will be proliferate as a poison source, and I put a couple of cards here that will be good proliferate as a poison source examples. First is Blightbelly Rat. That's a 2-mana 2/2 rat with Toxic 1. And also when it dies, it proliferates, which means it can, if it connects once, it gives one poison counter, then it can attack, and even if the opponent blocks, they will get a second poison counter. So this is a good card because it will give you like this inevitability at certain stage of, if they block it, well, probably it dies and then they get a poison counter. If they don't block it, well, it connects and they get a poison counter. If they kill it in the attack, still poison counter. So like a good source of like late inevitability. I can already imagine this being sort of a grown fest when you've stabilized the game, but you're a bit low on or a bit high on the poison counters, and the opponent plays Blightbelly Rat, and you're like, damn, what's going on? Another card that I want to showcase here is Whispered of the Dross. It's an instant target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, proliferate. The importance of that card is that it can kill like this odd blocker. It can win you some combats that you normally wouldn't have won. And while it does it, it also proliferates. So quite a good utility card. If you are into that plan, you probably want to play a couple of those. Because, if you have 1-drops that deal poison damage, you deal this 1 poison damage, they play a 2-drop, Whisper of the Dross, their 2-drop, kill it, and then attack you with your 1-drop again. All of a sudden the opponent is at 3 poison counters and they're staring on the into you having corrupt online, for example. The third card I put was Drown in Ichor. It's 2 mana sorcery. Target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn, proliferate. This again, because it's cheap and it removes quite a lot of creatures, it's going to be very powerful in those I try to kill with the poison damage strategies, because again, caveat, you want to get your first poison damage quite early, but once you do, you cast Drown in Ichor, remove a key blocker, swing with 3 toxic creatures, and all of a sudden the opponent is really uncomfortable. And also you proliferated, which sort of tagged along the extra counter for them. Proliferate as an option, and there's plenty of cards that have modalities, and one of the modalities proliferate. I want to showcase especially Contagious Vorak because it's a great case of being flexible. It's a 3-mana 3/3, fine. But when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a land card from among them and put it in your hand, which very often you will do early in the game, especially in best of 1, when Smoother does not allow you to sort of flood. So you want to have this 5th land, and Contagious Vorak is a very good guarantee that you're going to hit your 5 drops on the curve in those kind of more expensive, maybe green heavy decks. But you can always choose not to reveal the land card and put it in your hand. And if you don't, proliferate. So it gives you that flexibility. If you draw it like super late and you already have all the lands, you don't care about the next land on the board because you are flooded, you might as well proliferate and maybe put a couple of oil counters here and there, or maybe put a poison counter on the opponent. Very good card that allows you that flexibility. Also, it's like a sort of like a safety valve for missing with it. Because obviously, if you miss a land, you can still proliferate. So a nice fail-safe for that. Then you have Adaptive Spore Singer. It's 3-mana 2/2 with Vigilance. When it ETBs, choose 1. Target creature gets +2/+2 and gains Vigilance until end of turn. So it sort of gives haste to itself, but in a better way. Because it makes a creature much bigger, therefore will not be maybe able to be blocked in a useful way. But the second option on it is Proliferate. So if you don't have like anything good, maybe this is you don't have any creatures on board, or maybe the creatures that you have on board will still not have good attacks, you can still proliferate and get some value out of it. So again, slight flexibility. And the last card is choose 1, Thirsting Roots, 1 green. Choose 1, search your library for a basic card, reveal it and put it in your hand, then shuffle. I think very important card, especially if you want to have this kind of proliferate 3-color strategies, because you can cut a land or cut multiple lands even for Thirsting Roots. And if you're heavy green, you're still going to be able to fix your mana. You put a lot of forests, couple of or 3 of Thirsting Roots, 2 of Thirsting Roots. If you don't have the land of blue or black, you can use Thirsting Roots to fetch a land. But if you have enough mana and you don't need any more, then you can still use it as a proliferate card, so you increase your proliferate density in your deck, while you pay some cost for having lands that need to be fetched by mana, but but it's not such a big cost as the benefits are. And it's the same thing that we've seen recently with Bushwhack, when replacing a land with Bushwhack made the card much better than putting it as a playable inside of your deck, because then your modality was not really there. It was more like an emergency if I don't have a land. Here, you want to put yourself in a situation when Thirsting Roots by default is a land, and then in some rarer situations it will be a proliferate spell. That's where you want to have it, because that means that you have a land that can become a proliferate thing, but you still have a land possibility if you need it, rather than having it mainly as the second ability, because that means that you would put a 1 mana proliferate spell, which is just not good enough, I think, in the current thing. And also important that Thirsting Roots can fix your mana, which enables some sort of 5-color strategies, or 4-color strategies maybe, across the corrupted, proliferate, and toxic kind of wedges, to combine them all. And then there's proliferate as oil synergy, and I want to showcase a couple of cards here. Like, first of all, Volt Charge, because it's a red proliferate spell. Volt Charge is a 2 and a red instant, deals 3 damage to any target, proliferate. Now this proliferate is tagged along there, and maybe it will not have many uses, but it's worth noting that red and green are the colors where oil is predominant, and also blue. So oil is a sort of Timur kind of ability, even though it's present in other colors, but it's more apparent in Timur colors. Because of that, it is quite unique, because it's outside of that normal color pie for other proliferate spells. Therefore, it will be mainly useful for oil, because red doesn't have any toxic, which means that amplifying your poison counters with Volt Charge will be something that will not happen very frequently, and will not probably be even remotely even aimed at killing your opponent with 10 poison counters. Maybe, like, you have some kind of a weird Jeskai kind of deck that tries to get corrupted online or something. Second card I wanted to showcase is Unnatural Restoration, uncommon for 2 mana, 1 and a green. Sorcery, return target permanent from your graveyard to your hand, proliferate. I put this here because every single oil card is a permanent, which means that Unnatural Restoration plays very naturally, not unnaturally, very naturally with oil permanents, because you can return one. Of course, you cannot proliferate the one that you picked from the graveyard, but it lets you ramp other spells, other things that you have with oil, and return one of them to the battlefield, perhaps for some kind of synergies where multiple cards with oil are important. And then there's another one, Expand the Sphere. It's a 4 mana sorcery, 3 and a green. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. Put up to 2 lands from the among them into the battlefield tapped, and the rest of the bottom library at random order. If you put fewer than 2 lands into this battlefield this way, proliferate a number of times equal to the difference. So if you choose 0 lands, you proliferate twice. If you pick only 1 land, you proliferate once. You can choose that. And it's a nice thing, because you can ramp into those bigger oil payoffs, and at the same time, if you don't need more lands, you can just double proliferate and make your creatures bigger, give the value to something that accumulates oil counters beneficially, and so on and so on. So yeah, that's an interesting use of that card. Obviously, I don't think it's a great card, but I do think that it will have some fringe uses in decks that want to proliferate oil, for example. Having said that, oil is the biggest mechanic in the set, I think. Did we talk about how many toxic cards we have? I didn't even calculate, but I think that there is more oil cards than toxic. Oil, there's 46 cards with oil or oil synergies. They focus around the Timur, and I divided them by types of oil. And by types of oil, I mean how you use the card. And I used wherever I could. I used analogous cards from other sets that use some other types of counters. So I saw among the types of oil, there are relic amulets. If you remember, I'm going to remind what the card does. Will I? No. So Relic Amulet is a card from Zendikar Rising. Whenever you cast an instant sorcery or wizard, put a charge counter on Relic Amulet, and then you can pay 2 and tap it, remove all charge counters from Relic Amulet. It deals that much damage to target creature. And this basically means that those cards behave like they accumulate those oil counters, and then if they get to a certain threshold, you can remove those counters, and then you can restart the process of accumulating those counters and removing them again. The difference with those cards with Relic Amulet is that most of them they have a fixed number that you need to remove, and if you accumulate more, you don't need to remove everything like you did with Relic Amulet. And Relic Amulet was tricky to play because sometimes you put too many counters on it and you wasted some damage. There are serrated arrows, and I will insist on using the serrated arrows form on that one. Serrated arrows, if for those of you that played in Homeland, as many did, um, it's an artifact that comes into play with 3 arrowhead counters on it, and then you can remove an arrowhead to put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. And this way of operating means that you sort of come with a certain amount of a resource and you slowly deplete it, and once it hits 0, arrows were exiled. Here, most of those things, they will stay alive. Oh, cool. So there's more toxic. Thank you, bird person. So actually, there is more toxic than oil. Worth noting. So the difference is that most of those cards in here will just stay on board after you deplete those slow resources. But probably there will be no way of, barring very, very few cards, there is no way of replenishing them after you remove the last one, because you probably want to rely on proliferate on putting the extra counters on those type of things. Then there are Hex Drinkers. And Hex Drinker is a 1-mana creature from somewhere, some set. I don't know exactly where it was printed originally. It has level up. And then basically you level it up, and it's a 2-1 originally for 1 mana. When you level it up 3 times, it becomes a 4/4 with the protection from instants. And then when you level up, was it originally printed in Modern Horizons? Okay, I thought it was a reprint in Modern Horizons, but I accept that answer. When you get it to level 8, it becomes a 6/6 with protection from everything. Great skill. But if you can level it up till 20, but it doesn't change anything. And Hex Drinkers in this format are the things that need to reach a certain threshold of oil counters, and after that, it just doesn't matter that much if you add extras. Obviously, you can, but it just doesn't change anything how the card operates. You just want to reach a particular level, and after that, you're good. Then there's Fading. Oh, Midnight Clocks. Midnight Clock is a card from whatever. Was it Innistrad Midnight Hunt? I think. It's a 3-mana, 2 and a blue mana rock. It taps for blue. It has a 3-mana ability of putting an hour counter on Midnight Clock, and at the beginning of upkeep, you put an. It was Eldraine. Okay, yeah. At the beginning of each upkeep, you put an hour counter on the Midnight Clock, and when it reached 12th hour, so 12-hour counters, you basically exile the Midnight Clock and you draw 7. You basically shuffle your hand and graveyard into your library, and you draw 7 cards. So this type of effect, and yeah, obviously you exile Midnight Clock in the process. So this thing is like building to something big, and at the end of that, you collected everything and you lose your permanent, but you get some kind of a very powerful effect. So there's a couple of Midnight Clocks in this set. There's Fading. That's the 5th type of oil that I counted. Fading means that you start with some amount of oil counters. They get removed every turn or when something happens. And when you have 0 fading counters on the permanent, it dies. Very much like, Blastoderm. And there is basically a Blastoderm reprint in this format. Slightly better Blastoderm, maybe. Where it had 3 fading counters, and every turn you removed 1. When you removed all of them, it died. And the last category I have is the more the better. And there's a couple of cards that just the more oil counters you put on them, the better they become. You just want to put as many as possible. If you have a million oil counters on that permanent, it becomes great. And look, I'm not going to take fringe cases of, oh no, but then if they have 25, they will be killed by this spell that only kills creatures with 25 power. No, just let's assume that the more the better for you, um, and not counting, not counting, um, not counting fringe cases. So let's go to those. The oil relic amulets that I looked at. There's the Mercurial Spell Dancer. It's a 1 and a blue 2/1 creature, can't be blocked. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on Mercurial Spell Dancer. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may remove 2 oil counters from it. If you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So basically, what you do, you play it, you attack with it because it's unblockable. You cast a couple of spells. It gets two oil counters. You can cast your next spell and basically copy it. So you have to prep yourself for that, but it basically will double your spells once in a while. So like a classic relic amulet, you build up some counters, you remove the counters, you rebuild the counters, you remove some counters, and every time you do that, you get some value. Same goes for Serum Core Chimera, the red-blue signpost uncommon, 4 mana, 2 blue and red, flying 2/4. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on Serum Core Chimera, very much like Relic Amulets had it for spells or wizards. Then you can remove 3 oil counters from it, and then you draw a card. You may discard a card. When you do, and you discard a non-land, it deals 3 damage to any target, play it as a sorcery. So again, you build 3 counters, you remove the 3 counters, you get the draw, maybe you get a removal of one of the cards that you don't need, that is a non-land. Looks exactly like Relic Amulet. Its difference is it still can attack at the same time. Then we have a Charforger, that's a 3 mana black-red signpost, 1 black and red. At 2/3, when it TTBs, you get a 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature. And whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on it. You remove 3 oil counters from Charforger, exile the top card of your library, and you may play this card uh, until the end of turn. So this one has a slightly different way of triggering the oil counters on it than the other two, because the other ones had non-creature spells. This one is when creatures die. And it will, if it will get enough, you sort of get a draw a card for free, which is quite useful. And the last one is Norn's Wellspring, 2 mana artifact in white. It's a bit of an outlier here. Whenever a creature you control dies, you scry 1 and put an oil counter on it. You can tap it to remove 2 oil counters, and pay 1 mana and tap it to remove 2 oil counters from it and draw a card. So again, same way of activating the buildup of the counters as Charforger, but weirdly in white. And we'll give you some incidental card draw power. Difference with this one is that you actually have to pay mana and tap it, so you cannot activate multiple times in a turn, and you need to invest some mana in it. So the serrated arrows is, I have 3 examples here. First one is a Meldweb Strider. That's a 5 mana vehicle. It is a 5/5 with vigilance, crew 3, but it comes into the battlefield with an oil counter on it. And you can remove an oil counter from it, and it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. So you sort of get 1 free activation of it. But if you proliferate, it also can become more. And it's a vigilant threat. And it's a 5/5, which is quite big in this format. So I sort of didn't think much about this card, but during our Archetype Skeletons episode, Jason ILTG was really high on that card. And by really high, he said, "Oh, it's very decent. I think it's going to be pretty good in blue decks." And when Jason says something, I'm listening. So I think that this card might be better than it looks on the first look, because yes, you play nothing for 5 mana originally, but when you think about it, it's a creature that will probably be able to block, because it won't be removed as a vehicle. You will activate it only in the in the opponent's attack phase if you want to block with it, which means that it sort of dodges any kind of removal at sorcery speed, which is quite a large chunk of removal that can deal with it. So it's a fine thing to defend yourself, and later if you don't have to activate on the first turn, and you can get some proliferate going, it actually can become a threat that doesn't cost you too much to activate because you just need to remove that one oil counter, and it slams as a 5/5 vigilance and is ready to block on the crackback. Um, but again, it has this. It comes with a oil counter. You remove one, and you get some kind of a small value out of it. And if you put more counters, it can do it multiple times. Axiom Engraver, 2 mana 1/3, enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters, and you can tap it and remove an oil counter, and you rummage. Again, comes with 2. Once you deplete them, it's just a 1/3 vanilla. But by depleting them, hopefully you got at least the card's value. So maybe an interesting. I said 1/3 stats might be actually quite useful against lots of the toxic decks. And last one, Lattice Blade Mantis. That's a 4 mana 4/3. Enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters. Whenever it attacks, you may remove an oil counter from it. If you do, untap it, and it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Keyword big, good on offense, good on defense. I've seen some early stream games that this card looked pretty solid. And it's a classic serrated arrows because comes with 2, you remove it for some value. This one actually can be conditionally only activated when it attacks, so you can't do it even at will, but sort of works like serrated arrows in a way. The Hex Drinkers, there are 2. There are 2 Hex Drinkers. One is Ichor Synthesizer. We're going to talk about this card in detail quite soon. But whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Ichor Synthesizer. As long as it has 4 or more oil counters on it, it gets +2/+0 and can't be blocked. So once you get to 4, you don't care about any other oil counters on it because it becomes a 3/3 unblockable threat. You just want to get it to 4, and that's your target. You don't want 3, you don't 5, you don't care about. You want exactly 4. Armored Scrap Gorger is the second one. That's a 2 mana 0/3. It gets +3/+0 as long as it has 3 or more oil counters on it. It taps for mana of any color, and when it becomes tapped, if you exile a card from a graveyard, you put an oil counter on it. If you don't, I don't think you do. I still didn't check the exact wording, but I think that chat did in our skeleton stream. I think it works like that. That if there is no target for exiling a card, it won't get the oil counter. So it won't be as fast as you maybe think in the first place. But once you get to 3, nothing changes. If you get 17 oil counters on it, it still gets +3/+0. So it doesn't really change much. Still, card looks pretty sweet. 0/3 mana dork that can become a 3/3 later in the game. Whew, I'm in. The Midnight Clocks, again, there are 2. One is the Vindictive Flamestroker. 1 mana creature, a 1/2. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it. And it has 6 and a red. Sacrifice it, discard your hand, then draw 4 cards. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each oil counter on Vindictive Flamestroker. So obviously, this one doesn't need like 6 oil counters on it, but I mean, it's much better when you pay like 2 mana for drawing 4 cards or 1 mana for drawing 4 cards than if you play 5. So you want to get some of those oil counters. And once you activate the ability, it dies. So like Midnight Clock, it's a one-shot powerful ability. Drawing 4 cards is considered pretty strong. And it probably requires quite a lot of oil counters to make it mana efficient. And the last one is the Filigree Silex. That's a 2 mana artifact. It taps to put an oil counter on itself. But of course, you can use other kind of abilities to put counters on it. You can either sacrifice it and destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of oil counters on it. Keep in mind equal, so not equal or less. Make sure that you manage it nicely. In this way, it's more like sort of Ether Vial. But it also has a second ability, remove 10 oil counters from among permanents you control and sacrifice the Silex. And the Silex then deals 10 damage to any target. So keep in mind, not only the Silex oil counters, all the other oil counters will work, but it deals 10 damage, which is quite a lot. So I think that in a dedicated oil deck, you basically put yourself on the same kind of clock as toxic damage, because once you get the opponent to 10, I'm pretty sure you can squeeze out some other oil counters from other permanents to make sure that the Silex kills the opponent. Also can kill any target. And it also can be a sort of mini sweeper if you play it right. Fading, 2 cards again. Archfiend of the Dross, 4 mana, 2 and 2 black, flying 6/6. Enters the battlefield with foil oil counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove 1 counter from it. Then, if it has no oil counters on it, you lose the game. Whenever creature an opponent controls dies, its controller loses 2 life. So this is like sort of risky strategy because if you don't have ways of sacrificing it, there will be games when you play it, get a pacifism, and you basically die. But also pretty powerful. A 6/6 flyer for 4 mana is good. So you probably want to have some way of prolonging its life or sacrificing it in order to make sure that you won't lose. But it's so big that very often it will just overtake the game and win. Evolved Spinoderm, 4 mana, 5/5, comes with 4 oil counters, has trample as long as there's 2 or fewer oil counters, or has hexproof when it has, well, more than 2, basically. And at the beginning of your upkeep, remove an oil counter from it, and then if it has no oil counters, sacrifice it. So that's classic fading. It's a sort of kickback to Blastoderm, which was a 4 mana, 5/5 hexproof with fading 3. This has more fading, and it doesn't always have hexproof, but it has trample when it doesn't, which is also quite cool. And the last one, the more the better. And I think the chat was talking about the lack of +1/+1 counters. Well, sometimes oil counters do act like +1/+1 counters. Here's 4 examples of those. There's a 3 mana Troller Drake, a flyer, a 0/0 flyer. So it better have something extra. It enters the battlefield with an oil counter, and it gets +1/+1 for each oil counter. So basically, oil counters are +1/+1 counters in this case, but they are called oil counters. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Troller Drake. So yeah, you can play that on turn 3, turn 4. You can play like a cheap proliferate spell, and it becomes a 3/3 all of a sudden, and then you can start swinging with a 3/3 flyer. Necrosquito, it's a 4 mana 0/0 flyer, 3 in the black. Enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters, and it gets +1/+1 for each oil counter. So very much the same as the Troller Drake, but it gets more oil counters for a different mechanic. It gets whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, then you put an oil counter on Necrosquito. So sort of like you want to trade your creatures and this grows, or you want to sacrifice your creatures and this grows, that kind of stuff. Then we have Urabrask's Forge, the 3 mana artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you put an oil counter on the Forge. Then create an X1 red Phyrexian horror creature token with trample and haste, where X is the number of oil counters on Urabrask's Forge. So the turn you play it, you make a 1/1. Then you sacrifice the token at the beginning of the next end step. So it's sacrificed. Let's say that you have, for the sake of argument, that you play turn 3 Urabrask's Forge, you swing with a 1/1, it gets blocked and dies. No one cares about that much. Turn 4, you play Necrosquito, you put the counter on the Forge, make a 2/1 Trampler, attack with it. If it goes in, it goes in. If it gets blocked, it dies and grows Necrosquito. If it doesn't get blocked, at the end of the turn, you sacrifice it and it grows Necrosquito. So you have like sort of like way of getting oil synergies and way of getting those death triggers, which are relevant for some cards like the Necrosquito and like the red-green Char Forger that we mentioned before, the 2/3 that gets oil counters for every creature that dies on your side, and also lets you draw a card later, sort of draw a card. And Evolving Adaptive, which is, I think, constructed level card, I would say. It enters the battlefield with an oil counter on it, and it gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, if that creature has greater power or toughness than Evolving Adaptive, put an oil counter on Evolving Adaptive. So this you play it on turn one, you play a 2 drop on turn two, it becomes a 2/2. You play a 3 drop that has 3 power or 3 toughness on turn three, it becomes a 3/3. It really grows well with the game in those early stages. I think like a staple of a green aggro. There's also like a couple of cards that put oil counters on things, which can make it great if it survives the first turn and doesn't get -1/-1 or something. Um, and all those cards will become the better the more counters you have. Orobrask Forge with 1 million oil counters will produce a million one Trumpler, which is good. Necrosquito with million counters will be million, and so on and so on. Now, obviously, it's not only about the cards that have oil. It's also about how can I put things, how can I put more oil counters on my cards. It's all fine when you're playing green or blue because green and blue have proliferate. Red has very little proliferate, but actually red has several cards that can put oil counters on your things. And there's Churning Reservoir. At the beginning of your upkeep, put an oil counter on another target non-token artifact you control. So every turn at your upkeep, you can put an oil counter on something, either to get value by removing it or by putting it on one of those cards that the more the merrier. And also it has the ability to sacrifice two and tap. You create a 1/1 goblin. You can only activate it if oil counter was removed from a permanent control this turn, or a permanent with an oil counter on it was put into a graveyard this turn. So you can imagine you have a churning reservoir late in the game. You have something that has a ability of removing one oil counter from it to do something. You can just do that, and then you can create a 1/1 gobble because why not? Magmatic Sprinter, that's an interesting card. It's a 3 mana, 3/2 haste. When it enters the battlefield, you can put 2 oil counters on target artifact or creature you control, not necessarily on itself, on anything. And at the beginning of your end step, return it to your hand unless you remove 2 oil counters from it. So what you can do is you can play it, put 2 counters on itself, attack. At the end of the turn, remove the 2 oil counters. Next turn, attack. I mean, unlikely with the 3/2. So I think that this card will play out more like a grindy way of paying 3 mana, and then I have put 2 oil counters on something with buyback. Then it comes back to your hand. You replay it next turn, put 2 oil counters on something. Obviously, if you do that kind of stuff, you probably want to have one of those cards that benefit from having the more the merrier kind of situation with oil counters. Free from Flash, quite hopeful about this card's abilities. 1 mana instant, target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Put 2 oil counters on it. So think about it with the 1 drop that we were discussing that grows with creatures. You might grow it for the first 3 turns, and now it's a 3/3. You attack with it, no blocks. You play free from Flash. It gets +2/+2 from the actual card, and you put 2 oil counters on it. It becomes a 7/7. You just had a swing for 7. And next turn, they have to deal with at least a 5/5 because those oil counters will stay on it, obviously. And with many other cards, this card has quite some good synergies. It's also a non-creature spell, so it will be pretty good with all the cards that have, whenever you play non-creature spell, put oil counters, because it will put not only give +2/+2, but put 3 oil counters on that kind of card. And the last one is Furnace Skullbomb, 1 mana Skullbomb. So it has 1, sacrifice it, draw a card. And for 1 in red, you can sacrifice it to put 2 oil counters on target artifact or creature, draw a card, activate a sorcery. Which, sorcery speed is not great, but you draw a card, it's quite cheap. And if you really want to put multiple oil counters on something, maybe that's the way. And if even if you don't have a target for it, you can just cycle it basically. And there's some oil enablers and payoffs. Urbrask's Anointer, that's a 3 and red artifact creature, 4/2. When it enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to any target where X is the number of permanents you control with oil counters on them. And there will be decks where this card is going to be great, but it's sort of like a slightly worse version of Basalt Ravager, and I can use that analogy because we're just after Kaldheim, Return of Kaldheim. Basalt Ravager was the giant that when it entered the battlefield, it pinged any target for the number of uh, creatures that have the same type that is the highest of whatever creatures you control. And that was great because that one baseline was it's a 4 mana 4/2 that picks for one because it of course counted itself, so giant and wizard. This card doesn't have that. This card can just be played as a vanilla 4/2 if you don't have any permanents with uh, oil counters. So it requires it has a lower floor, and the ceiling is not particularly higher than the Basalt Ravagers. Um, so you have to probably pick it when you need it and when your deck allows you to play it. But it's actually good news because Basalt Ravager, because the rate was so good, even if it didn't have too many tribal synergies, people just picked it and splashed it because you had maybe one changeling, you play it and it pinks for two. This one won't be picked by some decks because they would just have zero oil synergies, and then you have to play a vanilla 4/2 with which is not a great rate. So if you are into oil synergies, you might get it later in the draft. And it also will be a great signal that the oil synergy decks are not particularly highly prioritized on your pod because you will see the late Urbrask's Anointer. And if there was another oil synergy person on the pod, they would definitely pick it because it's really great when you can ping for 3 or for 4 even. Um, then there's Oil Gorger Troll, 5 mana, 3 and 2 green. 3/4. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. Then, if you control a permanent with an oil counter on it, draw a card. Again, I think that if you don't have permanents with oil counter, that card is medium or even bad. But if you have, draw a card changes quite a lot in the card evaluation. If you reliably, 80% of the time, draw a card from Old Gorger Troll, mwah, chef's kiss. You get 3 life, you get a body that is actually significant for this format, and you draw a card. I mean, love it. Then we have Cinderlash Ravager. That's 6 mana, so 4 red green, 5/5 with vigilance. It costs 1 less to cast for each permanent you control with oil counters on it. And when it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. So yeah, I mean, if you get it for 4 mana, that's a great rate for a 5/5 vigilance. And I don't think it's going to be that difficult looking at dedicated oil decks at the early access stream. You will be very frequently having those curve outs when you have 2-drop creature with oil, 3-drop creature with oil, and turn 4 Cinderlash Ravager, maybe even kill something because it pings for 1. Who knows? So yeah, looks pretty solid. And then there's the Oil Lord. It's the Ichor Plate Golem, 3 mana for a 2/3 colorless artifact creature. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it has 1 or more oil counters on it. Put an oil counter on it. Now, this is great for a subset of the oil creatures that we talked. It's good with serrated arrows, says. It's bad with relic amulets because they enter with no oil counters. So serrated arrows is that sort of increases their utility by 1. It's not good with hex drinkers because they don't enter with anything. It's not great with midnight clocks. It's great with fading creatures. And it's great with the more the better because they usually come in with an oil counter, except for Urbrask Forge. But you have to keep in mind that the Ichor Plate Golem only works with a subset of the oil permanents in terms of giving them extra oil counter. However, it also gives a +1/+1 to every single creature you control that has oil counters on them. So there is extra value in that. In general, it looks like pretty strong. If you have lots of oil, it's going to be great. But what you want to have really is things that have entered the battlefield with oil counters and are creatures to maximize its rate. Right. Last mechanic for Mirrodin. There's 18 cards with for Mirrodin or with equip synergies. It's an ability that whenever you play an artifact, you make an additional 2/2 and you attach the equipment to it. It's in Boros mainly. There is 1 green and 1 blue equipment that has for Mirrodin. And in terms of the types of equipment, There is vanilla for Mirrodin, and there are some that boost synergy, and there are a couple of equipments that are not even for Mirrodin, so they are sort of Phyrexian equipments or whatever. In terms of vanilla for Mirrodin, we're talking about cards like Barb Batterfist. That's a 2 mana equipment with for Mirrodin, so it's a 2 mana 2/2, and that comes equipped with the +1/-1. So basically, it comes in as a 3/1 vanilla. And later, if the 3/1 dies, you still have that equipment when you can give +1/-1 to something. Obviously, will play nicely with evasive threat, maybe trampling threats, something like that. That power is actually beneficial for them. Maybe first striking threats, something like that. Gold Warden's Helm, 3 mana for Mirrodin. So enters with a 2/2 attached to it, and it becomes a 2/3 because it gives +0/+1. Equip cost is 1 and a white. It looks pretty medium, but who knows. And Silvok Battle Chair, that's a 6 mana for green for Mirrodin, comes with the 2/2, but the 2/2 gets +4/+4, so it's a 6/6 and has trample, and you can re-equip it for 5 and green. So that's like the chunky kind of for Mirrodin equipment. And also not worth noting, this is one of the ones that is outside of normal colors, so you probably won't be playing it in synergistic for Mirrodin decks, but just basically as a 6/6 vanilla that later can become an equipment that makes everything bigger and trampling. There's 2 equipments that boost synergy, and that's Bladehold War Whip. That's a 1 red white for an equipment for Mirrodin, so it comes with a 2/2, and it gives it double strike, so it's a 2/2 double striker. But it also makes equip abilities of other equipment cost 1 less to activate, which, equipment cost is a very important parameter of how you evaluate the equipment. You want to have it cheap so you can do it multiple times in one turn, move it from one creature, attack with it, move it to another creature for blocks, and so on. So that's sometimes going to be useful. It has equipped for 5 mana itself, so it's quite expensive, but still 3 mana 2/2 double striker is good. And if you're like heavy on the equipment, which you can be in this format because every single one of those equipments will make a 2/2 as it goes in, so you have less problems with density of creatures, and you don't have that issue when, oh no, I drew 3 equipments and I don't have anything to equip them with. Well, now you have, because you have the 2/2. Hexgold Hoverwings, that's a 4 mana equipment with 4 Mirrodin. Equipped creature has flying, and creatures you control that are equipped get +0/+1, which means it itself gives +1/+0 to the creature that it equips, the 2/2, so it's a 3/2 flyer. But every that you have that is equipped will get a +1 attack bonus. So if you had the Bladehold War Whip on board when you played the Hexgold Hoverwings, now your 2/2 double striker becomes a 3/2 double striker, which is quite an upgrade. So these 2 are the only things that do it. And there's a couple of equip payoffs and enablers. I counted 8 of them. Here there are some examples. There is Oxida Finisher, 5 red, 7/5 ogre, but it has affinity with trample, but it has affinity for equipment. So for every equipment that you control, it becomes 1 mana cheaper. I think that for me to be interested, 5 mana probably would be good. So if I have a deck that has, 6, 7 for Mirrodin equipments, I'm probably happy to play Oxida Finisher. Importantly, it has affinity for equipment, not for equipped creatures. So even if they kill your equipped creatures, you're left with a bunch of equipment hanging around. Oxida Finisher is going to be still cheaper. I think perfect target to put the double strike equipment, because 7/5 double strike tends to end the games quite rapidly. There's Jorkadin, first Gold Warden. I think that this is the card that would put me on the path to drive Boros. I don't think that this archetype looks particularly strong. Of course, time will tell, but I think that some of those equipments are slightly underrated. They can't make very good for Mirrodin equipment, because if they do, other decks will just cannibalize them. And I don't think that they put enough synergy to tie it together, that playing red-white synergistic deck is going to be a big benefit. So, and there's also a problem with white being heavy on toxic and red not, which means there's going to be a clash with what you want to do. maybe you want to do some corrupted things early in the game and later take over with damage from the equipments to kill with actual life total attack. But Jurkadine is a red and a white 2/2 with trample. Whenever it attacks, it gets +X until end of turn, where X is the number of equipped creatures you control, and if its power is 4 or greater, draw a card. So, say you have 2 equipment on board. Um, you equip Jorkadin with one, the other one is equipped with the 4 Mirrodin creature. You swing with this one, it becomes a 4/4 with trample. You draw a card, and then they still have to deal with quite a large creature that actually didn't cost much. So, yeah, looks pretty solid if you can slightly build around it. I guess that because your equipment are creatures, you can actually afford to play some combat tricks as well. So, cards like Jorkadin with being Trampler, being probably a prime target for blocks, might be actually quite useful. And then there's a Blade Graph Aspirant. That's 2 and a red for a 2/3 menace. Equipment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Activate abilities of equipment you control that target it only cost 1 less to activate. So, yeah, if you have a lot of the Mirrodin equipment, Bladegraft Aspirant on turn 3 can curve into a 5 mana equipment that makes a 4/3 vigilance creature, but now it will cost 4, so you have a 4 mana 4/3 vigilance that leaves behind an equipment that you can quite cheaply attach to Bladegraft Aspirant and make it a 4/4 menace vigilant creature, which is quite useful. So I think that, yeah, this is a common way of having the enablers and payoffs for the equip. So maybe worth noting, if you play a white red, you want to get all the copies of that kind of thing. And menace is a good ability when you make a big creature. Right. That I think concludes the portion when I talk about the mechanics. Now I want to switch to the end part of the podcast, when I'm going to talk about how I come up with the plan during the theory crafting. And also, same steps can be used not only for theory crafting, but also for looking at decks later in the format when it's not purely theory, because you have some good data to back you up, and you can maybe try to find hidden archetypes, maybe find out the plan that you're going to try to implement, and maybe the type of decks that you want to draft in each color. So it's going to be structured in a way that I first come up with the first step of the plan, to try to discuss it. Why do I do it? How do I do it? And so on. And then as we proceed, I'm going to add next steps of the plan, and we're going to discuss them, and so on and so on. And in the end, we're going to see the deck that I built, so you can follow my rationale. I'm not saying that the deck is perfect. I'm just going to show you what kind of thought process I put in into making this type of decks. So first, I pick a color combination. And obviously, you have to pick a color combination to start crafting around a deck. But it doesn't have to be a color combination. Maybe it's like an individual card that you're interested that you want to build around, and figure out how to build a build around. But it's good to start with something that has a definition of the rest of your process. I want to build around this. I want to build a good black-green deck. I want to build a solid deck that splashes 5 colors, for example. And that's your definition of your project, of coming up with a plan for something. In this case, I looked at blue-red spells. I just like blue-red spells tempo decks in limited. And that's enough of a reason for me to try to play with it. Who said that the reason has to be other than that? And, it can be later in the format that you want to come up with a Simic deck, because you know that Simic is heavily underdrafted. And because it's heavily underdrafted, you will have access to it much more often. So you want to have a solid plan what to do when I'm given the Simic lane quite open, because it will happen frequently. And if you have a good plan, and you have a deck that maybe people don't know exists, you will be able to abuse the meta game and win a lot of games, because you're going to get all the best cards of the combination that people undervalue, and so on. So, second step for me is to find a card that might be both undervalued and good. This is before the set is being released, so I don't know either if the card that I picked is going to be undervalued, and I don't know if it's going to be good. But I had to pick something, so I picked Ichor Synthesizer. At 2 mana, 1 in the blue, 1/3. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it, and as long as it has 4 or more oil counters, it gets +2/+0, and it can't be blocked, so it's a 3/3 unblockable threat. So why did I pick this card? Well, I think that it's good at early defense in this format, because toxic creatures are rather on the smallish side. Um, Big creatures cost quite a lot of mana, so I think it can keep me alive for the first couple of turns by blocking the 2/2s, by blocking the 1/1s, keep me also from being too much poisoned early. Um, so yeah, that's a good knock. That's a good thing in favor of it. Now it's potentially powerful because a 3/3 unblockable threat ends games quite rapidly. Um, it needs some work, so there is things to build around it, and that's also something I find pleasant. That I think that the fact that it needs some work touches my creative side, and I really want to see how can I make that card work, because 4 oil counters is a lot. 4 spells, that's not every game you're going to cast 4 spells, so probably I want to do it with fewer spells than 4 to bring it online. But more or less, I think that looking at the spoiler, it is slightly supported, because it's part of the spell synergy in red green in red blue. Uh, and also there are similar cards present in the format that use similar mechanics, so I can pile those synergies on top of each other. And while trying to build a deck around Ichor Synthesizer, I'm also going to sort of by accident build a deck that is good with other types of cards that use the same kind of ability, that have, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on something. So by building an Ichor Synthesizer deck, I'm also building a deck that will be good with those other cards. So first step is to find cards that do similar things, because I want to have multiples of ways that my synergy is going to benefit from, not only that one Ichor Synthesizer. I don't want to build like all the weight of the deck is on that poor Ichor Synthesizer. I want to have diverse strategy, but uses kind of similar mechanics. So there is a bunch of cards in blue and red that have that kind of ability. Ichor Synthesizer, importantly, is a common, and it's important that this synergy thing will exist at common, because you will get more access to it. You can get like 4 Ichor Synthesizers if no one is interested in them in your pod, if you are in the right pod. And maybe you can get some other common things. So one thing that I have here is Soulblade Scamp. So red mana, a 1/1 haste creature. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it, remove an oil counter, tap, remove an oil counter from it. It deals 1 damage to each opponent. So it's like a very super early threat. I can play it early, which is great, because if I have it in my opening hand, I will definitely play it before I start casting any non-creature spells. So fantastic option. And it can maybe push 2 damage early, and later it can stay back and slowly ping the opponent. I'm happy with my 1-drop doing 4-5 damage. That's absolutely great for it, because quarter of the life was done, quarter of the needed life total was reduced by like a common 1/1 haste creature. So that's like a decent card that I might be thinking about putting in the kind of a deck, and has similar synergies as the Ichor Synthesizer. Then there's the Troller Drake. We talked about it. A 3 mana flying 1/1. Gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on Troller Drake. As I said, I want to speed up getting my Ichor Synthesizer to the 4 oil counters. Well, Troller Drake, if I speed it up and I put multiple counters on it, it becomes a very big threat very quickly. It's also evasive. So, if I can put 4 counters on Troller Drake instead of my Ichor Synthesizer, I'm ending up with a 5/5 flyer, which is arguably better than a 3/3 unblockable. So yeah, cool card to think about it in this deck. Mercurial Spelldancer, that's a rare, but we talked about it already. 2/1 unblockable, which again fits with my theme of I don't want to be blocked, I want to be very evasive. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it, and it can copy a spell I want to cast spells, therefore copying a spell is great for me. Also, it gets the all counters for me casting those spells. So it's sort of like both payoff, enabler, and everything in one. Also evasive threat for what I'm doing. So yeah, that looks like a great card for building my deck. And there's the Serum Core Chimera. We talked about it as well. A 4-mana flyer, 2/4. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Serum Core Chimera. And then you can remove 3 oil counters from it. And then you draw a card. You might discard something. And when you do that, it deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. And if I don't, I just drew a card, which is great. So again, if I want to put multiple counters on things, probably proliferate will be part of the solution. And if proliferate is part of the solution, I put multiple counters, not only on the Troller Drake, not only on the Mercurial Spell Dancer, but also on the Serum Core Chimera, which will in turn will let me draw more cards, which in turn will let me play more spells, which in turn will activate all those synergies. So yeah, quite cool. I'm starting to look at those cards and try to position them in the deck. Maybe some will make it, maybe some will not make it. Maybe my perfect vision of the deck will contain some, but I will sometimes just maybe draw like a 5 Soulblade Scamp deck when I just like my only plan is play as many of them as early as possible and then ping opponent for free every turn and cast a spell and ping them for free again and that kind of stuff. So maybe there will be like diverse plans that I will keep in mind, but I will have the optimal in the foreground, and then there will be the plan B. What happens when I open 0 synthesizers but many Soulblade Scamps? Maybe I'll slightly change it, for example. So fourth step of my planning is usually identifying the weaknesses. I think that it's important to look at where the problems are with the deck, because once you identify the problem, you can start thinking, okay, what do I need to make that problem less of a problem? And if you make the problem less of a problem, if you find the cards that are very important to to uh, plug the holes that you have in your strategy, then you can actually come up with a brilliant archetype and with the brilliant way of the deck that you're trying to play. So in this case, I identified 3 big weaknesses. It's like the Ichor synthesizer is pretty slow to go online. That's a problem because tempo decks, they want to put a real clock on board. They really want to focus on both disturbing the strategy of your opponent, but at the same time, they need to threaten with something more than a 1/3. So that Ichor synthesizer must go online quickly. Second weakness, the deck needs high non-creature density because you want to cast non-creature spells. And that's a problem because if you have high non-creature density, you will not build up enough board presence. And because you don't build up enough board presence, again, your clock is slightly slow. So there needs to be a solution to that problem. And third, that deck may be bad in the late game because tempo decks don't age well. I mean, if you didn't deal like 12 damage early, you might never do that. So we need we need some ways of making sure that we either have a solution of what happens when we go to the late game, or we build a deck in such a way that late game will barely ever happen. God, talking is hard. Okay, so step 5 is obviously, since we identified the weaknesses, we try to minimize them. So first weakness was that it's pretty slow to go online. And I look at the cards that we have here, and I identify several cards that help me. First, Free from Flash. The instant that target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and you put 2 oil counters on it. This means that I can put 3 counters on the Ichor synthesizer instantly just by paying 1 mana. Which means that if I played 1 more non-creature spell beforehand, this goes from being a 1/3 with 1 oil counter into a 5/5 unblockable with 4 oil counters. And this can be like a super explosive start when I play this on turn, Ichor synthesizer on turn 2. Turn 3, I play some sort of spell, non-creature spell, and this I swing for 5. And from then on, I have a 5-turn clock just from that one Ichor synthesizer that the opponent must deal with. And if I'm on the play, that is probably a clock that is sufficient if my deck is built around disturbing their strategies. If I have some counter spells, or if I have some bounce spells, or if I have some removal, they are not going to be. I'm not going to make it easy for them um, to race me. Second thing is experimental augury. That's a 2 mana instant. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Proliferate. So first of all, it's a spell which already puts one counter. Then second counter comes from proliferate. I'm halfway there, and then I can select one of the 3 cards, which will give me a huge choice of what I have, which hopefully will allow me to make it online next turn that I can do. So a great spell that will, especially when I have multiples of those Ichor synthesizers on board, this can be really threatening because I have like 2 of them on board. I put in total of 4 all counters. I look for another proliferate spell, and the next turn I put both of them online. I start swinging for 6. Great. Um, then we have things like Volt Charge, which allow me to slow down the opponent because Volt Charge kills a creature while at the same proliferating and putting an extra counter on my Ichor synthesizer. So basically, this acts not only as the ramp to how fast I put oil counters on my Ichor synthesizer, but also slows down the opponent quite actively, therefore giving me more time. Tempo is all about stretching time and killing their 3/3 while making my thing closer to become a 3/3 unblockable is exactly the way of getting there. And as I told you already in the first slides about the archetype, Ichor synthesizer itself is helping me with giving me extra time because 1/3 is probably good enough to block for a couple of turns and soak up some damage. Okay, the deck needs high non-creature density. And that is always a problem of spells deck, that you will often fly close to the sun with having just enough threats or not enough threats. And I have some plan. Like, first of all, there is for Mirrodin equipment in this set, and these are creatures that are not creatures when you cast them. So I can play my barbed butterfist. I can play some other equipment from with for Mirrodin in this archetype, and I can actually put creatures on board without casting creature spells and with activating the abilities of things that trigger on non-creature spells. There is the Meldweb Strider, the vehicle that I mentioned before, which also is sort of technically a creature because it can crew itself once. I also play a lot of proliferate, so maybe will be able to crew itself multiple times. But if I cast it as a non-creature spell, which is great because then again I can increase the creature density in my deck, threat density in my deck, while at the same time being able to trigger all those non-creature spells. And last, experimental augury also looks at the top 3 cards of my library, except for proliferating. And because of that, I have a good selection, which means that if I drew a hand where I have lots of spells but few threats, I can play the experimental augury and hopefully find a creature through that because I have quite some card selection using that card, and therefore will be able to maybe find my Ichor synthesizer for the next turn. All right. Last part, it may be bad in a late game. And as I said, one of the best solutions that it may be bad in a late game is never to lead to a late game. But if you want to build a deck that is more resilient in the late game, there are a couple of ways of doing that. One is playing. I hope that this thing is in the set. Is it? It is in the main booster set. No, it's not only one of those special cards. But you can put a bomb like Ovika Enigma Goliath. That's a 7-mana 6/6 with flying, with ward, pay 3 life. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create X 1/1 red per X and goblin creature tokens, where X is the mana value of that spell. They gain haste until end of turn. So you just generate like tons of goblins. It's an example of a bomb. There are plenty of bombs in this format, but having bombs is a good way of having a late game plan. I already have good card selection, so if I get a bit flooded, I can cast my experimental augury, and because I do that, I can actually find my bombs, and then I can actually have a strong late game. Other thing that I can do is that this card is based on the density of spells. If I have spells that draw multiple cards, like Vivisurgence Insight, the 5 mana draw 3 proliferate, which again is sort of on plan, I can have slightly better reach, because maybe I will not overcome my opponent with something big, but I might just get enough cards to stop their strategy to the extent where my unblockable threats are going to win. And of course, not being good in late game means that opponent is playing big things, and nothing deals better with big things than counter spells. So there is a spell like Reject Imperfection, which is a counter for 3 mana, sort of cancel. If the spell that you countered had mana value 3 or less, you proliferate. So it is still on plan. You can counter something smaller and proliferate your oil counters. But if you end up in the late game, this can stop them from playing that big thing that was supposed to win them the game, and you can slowly take over with your unblockables. There is one big weakness that I've sort of identified, but I couldn't find a solution. And that's also important to admit to yourself that, there are some things I can't deal with it. I mean, my creatures are small, and I have few of them, and removal exists. And if opponents kill enough of my stuff, I will have a problem of finishing the game. And I didn't find a good solution to that, barring maybe putting some alternative win cons, like maybe the mill artifact for 1 that comes with 2 oil counters. If I proliferate enough, I might get it to like 5-6 oil counters and then mill them for 6 as a sort of like an alternative win con. But there is no hexproof blue card in this set, and it would be great to have one, like preferably 2 mana, target creature you control gains hexproof, proliferate. That would be a perfect spell for my deck. Unfortunately, there is not, so it's hard to protect my creatures. I will have to hope that I generate enough value through them that they will survive and maybe counter some of the removal spells. And the last thing that is left for that is to build a deck. And this, of course, is a skeleton. I have no idea how it will work. I have no idea how it will play. But I came up with having 7 creatures in the deck. 4 of them are Ichor Synthesizers. 1 is Mercurial Spelldancer, the 2-1 that cannot be blocked. 1 Troller Drake and 1 Serum Core Chimera. Now, this is like a maximum synergy kind of creature base. When all these things trigger on me casting non-creature spells, I have 7 creatures, which means that the rest of my deck, that's 17, are non-creature spells. So I have plenty of value to trigger their abilities. Then I have all the non-creature spells. I have 2 free from flash, the 2+2+2, put 2 oil counters, combat trick, Hex Gold Slashes, the deal 2 damage to target creature, or 4 if it has toxic spell. Very cheap way of dealing with their early aggression, to stopping them from having dynamic starts, and therefore giving me time to make my synthesizers online. Surgical Skull Bomb. That's the blue Skull Bomb that can bounce something. Again, I play it as a spell. Later, I can activate it to bounce something, to buy myself time, draw a card. Skull Bomb itself, when I have a creature on board, can trigger the all counters from my other creatures. I have a Bring the Ending, that's a sort of quench. I'm not having any toxic, so it will forever be a quench in this deck, but I don't plan for the late game. So for me, counter something unless opponent plays 2 is probably just enough. 2 Experimental Auguries. Look at the top 3 cards, pick 1. Barbed Butterfist, one of the equipments that is a non-creature creature. Hexgold Halberd, that's another 2-drop for Mirrodin equipment. I have 2 Thrills of Possibility to filter if I flood or something, or if I have something that is absolutely useless, and draw some cards. And while I'm doing, put oil counters on my things. 1 Reject Imperfection, 2 Volt Charges, and Vivisurgence Insight. Again, adding to removal, adding to counter spell suite, and then adding to the card draw. Vivisurgence Insight is my top end, basically, for 5 mana, draw 3 cards, proliferate, maybe later in the game, to replenish what I have. And it's important also to think about the mana base. I have 16 lands in this deck because I'm relatively cheap, but I still want to be sure that I'm casting my stuff. 1 Terramorphic Expanse to fix mana. I don't have that many 1-drops in this version, so I can easily play a tap land on turn one. Um, and also it filters my library from lands so I can have more spells later. And I have two of the spheres. I have one red sphere and one blue sphere. You can sacrifice those to draw a card later in the game, which again sort of increases my spell density, because those lands, after I hit like six, I don't need them anymore. I can sacrifice them and um, draw a card and hopefully draw some more gas. So basically, this is the deck. This is the process I'm going through in my head in order to come up with those type of skeletons. I thought it would be useful to share it, because that way it gives you tools to try to figure out your archetypes, and we need more people to figure out archetypes, because I think that lots of color combinations, even with 17 lands, even with many people playing, are maybe slightly underexplored, and it would be great if they would be explored to a higher extent. Um, right, just under 2 hours. I'm outperforming myself, but we reached the end of the podcast. I would like to thank the 17 Lands team, Viral Misnomer, Hululu, Grant Wu, and Ale Ballini, who is doing amazing work in getting every set online in recent sets. I would like to thank Fake Jake Brown, who will help me to release it as a podcast, and always has and always is receptive and actively trying to push me in the right directions. So thank him for that. I would like to thank um, some people that I rarely thank, but I really well, they really help me in my life a lot, and that's the Scryfall team. Every set when it's released, most of the stats I do on the cards, I use Scryfall a lot because of the functionality and speed and in usefulness and awesomeness. So send some love to the Scryfall team. I'm a patron, and I think that even a one-time donation will probably help them survive. And without Scryfall, I don't know how magic can work. Of course, thanks to MTGA Zone for the sponsorship of this podcast, even though I'm not doing much in terms of writing articles, and that their patience is incredible. So thank them for that. And thanks to SSQ and Mana Junkie for the music that I use in the podcast version of it. And with that, I'll see you next week when we will have a second part of the primer, this time focusing on color pairs and how do I see them.